Good artists copy. Great artists steal. I steal from every single movie ever made. Macaroni, Clock, Fungus, Wimble, Womble, Rick and Morty. These aren't just quotes pulled from some random internet philosophers on Reddit. These are some of the most famous and influential visionaries from multiple generations giving their thoughts on influence and theft in creative fields. Pablo Picasso, Quentin Tarantino, and me after scarfing down a 4 for 4 and 6 liters of Mountain Dew before throwing up in a Wendy's parking lot. Any surface level similarities between two projects in any field seem to produce the same response. You're just ripping off these other guys. We see it in tech, in food, in fashion, really anywhere, but it becomes far more accusatory in tone when it's directed at films, shows, and games. These fields are so driven by creative, fresh ideas that people find it disingenuous if somebody passes off other ideas as their own and then take credit for it. I don't really care which chip company came up with the idea of the salt and vinegar variant and who copied who, or if Supreme and North Face both try and sell me a white t-shirt with a red box on it. But you try and blatantly copy my favorite movie of all time and pass it off as your own, now it's a problem. Interestingly enough, I feel like if you're more obvious about your theft, people give you more of a pass. Imitation or theft feels a little bit more accepted in music than anywhere else because of the prevalence of sampling and interpolating. Taking something that's very obviously recognizable and saying, hey look, I put it in this new place with a new twist.
Give me money. Money me. Money now. Me a money needing a lot now.
Hip-hop is the most listened to genre in America right now, and it has a heavy reliance on sampling, even from its most famous acts. Kanye West made a huge name for himself producing music that lifted aspects of dozens of other songs, including vocals, and then repackaging them into a spiffy new track. And he then went on to not make a name for himself in any other way. There simply wasn't anything else of note that Kanye did that could have possibly defined his legacy more than his production style. No siree. That all said, people will still rightfully get upset when Vanilla Ice says something like this after being accused of stealing the bass line from Under Pressure.
Sampled them from him, but it's not the same bass line. Like it goes ding 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 diggy ding ding, ding 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 diggy ding ding, ding ding ding. That's the way theirs goes. Ours goes ding 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 diggy ding ding. Ding, 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 ding.
How I Met Your Mother was called a Friends ripoff, and Friends was called a Seinfeld ripoff because they had similar formats and rehashed ideas from their predecessors, even though they also have elements that set them apart. Joker is Taxi Driver without ever saying it's Taxi Driver, so apparently it shouldn't get the praise it does, but Stranger Things will go as far as to have famous 80s actors in their show set in the 80s that imitates media from the 80s, but it's an homage, so it's actually fine? The question I asked myself when thinking about this whole mess is, where's the line? Everything is influenced by something, but how close can you get to the original before it starts feeling underhanded? Can it even be underhanded if some of the most creative individuals with some of the most recognizable and distinct styles are directly claiming to have stolen from others? I've used the term ripoff to describe things before, and I'm sure I will again, but when, if ever, do people deserve to be called out for stealing ideas, and when is that response uncalled for? It's a little bit hard to answer a question that nebulous though, so let's narrow our sights down just to games, because, you know, I know like 3 things about the music industry, and I already said them all that last paragraph. There's no shortage of alleged ripoffs that come to mind. Even in the last couple of weeks, I've talked about KO the Kangaroo's suspicious similarities to Crash Bandicoot, and yes, I do know how to say his name now after spending 13 minutes calling him Cow the Kangaroo. I've mentioned Reaver and how closely it resembles Ultra Kill, and I think it's pretty clear at this point that I have an unhealthy obsession with Uncharted, which was first dubbed as not only a ripoff of Tomb Raider, but also Indiana Jones. But before we get too wrapped up rattling off comparisons left and right, I think we should start with a general look at where most of the finger pointing begins: the visuals. Art style is a huge reason why people whip out their binoculars and pull out their pitchforks. The more distinct a game's art style is, the more unethical it seems to emulate it. The first game that comes to mind for me that met some backlash for that very issue is Crowsworn, which borrows so heavily from Hollow Knight's style that if you were in the dark about their marketing and the existence of Silksong, you might just think they came from the same dev team. They're both atmospheric Metroidvanias with clean, bold artwork and thick black outlines, also featuring similar attack animations, enemy types, and assets. Immortals Phoenix Rising was also met with criticism over its very open imitation of Breath of the Wild, including its visuals, which began with its minimal world with the same cartoon style as Link's last outing, and moved all the way to its eerily similar climbing cycle and stamina bar. Replaced was deemed a ripoff of The Last Night, despite the former only really having a 1-minute long trailer to its name. Zero gameplay, zero hands-on time, and yet just because it looked similar similar to this project that was deemed to be very visually distinct, all of a sudden even the creator of The Last Night found it weird that his game wasn't pointed out as an influence. It makes sense why art is the first thing that triggers our sensors for theft. It's the easiest thing to notice because it's right there in front of our eyes, but I really think that's a bad way to identify a shameless cash grab leeching off of another game's success. I'd argue that a much worse case of theft would be to lift large portions of the level or world design from another game, but that's not always immediately apparent because level layouts don't make the same imprint on your brain as the overall aesthetic of an experience. If something like The Last Case of Benedict Fox decided to copy room layouts straight from Axiom Verge, as long as they made tiny changes or didn't borrow too much, they could easily get away with it without anyone noticing, because they look nothing alike and all the bells and whistles could hide the similarities from eagle-eyed players. The effort it would take to copy those platforms and layout would be far less than the effort it would take to recreate an art style, and the work it would save a studio would be even greater. A level designer could probably Frankenstein a bunch of rooms from a bunch of different games and mock up level blueprints that have already been tried and tested, only needing to redesign marquee areas from scratch. And they might not even get called out for stealing because we just don't see it as easily. If you were gonna steal from other games, this is how you do it. This is how you'd get the highest reward at the lowest risk. It would be far more egregious and more deserving of harsh criticism, but I can't remember the last time something like that happened, or at least was noticed by the general public. And yet, trailers for new games are judged for their similar appearances before we even get a chance to know how they play, what changes they bring, and the design decisions they made, because the art team had a general reference that they wanted to follow. Even if you have that reference, you still need to create your own character models, animations, and concept art. Your job is far from over just because you've seen somebody do something similar before. Just because we notice something doesn't mean it's inherently sinister, and not everything sinister is gonna be noticed. I tend to give art a big pass because you can't download an art style for a game. There's no www.rentahollowknight.com that people can use for a get-rich-quick scheme. Outside of extreme examples like the random asset flip titles you see in the Steam equivalent of Nocturne Alley, most of these visually similar titles need talented people doing good work and imparting their own creativity onto the product, even with a frame of reference. But what if they're not just visually similar? What about the games that take it a step further and start to borrow from the tone, structure, and gameplay of something else? At that point, I think the separating factor is the level of improvement or interesting new features that the new game introduces to contribute to the lineage of its specific genre. I mentioned Immortals Phoenix Rising earlier, and I think a big reason why that game is still immediately linked to Breath of the Wild is because it waters down the elements it took from that game and doesn't give too much back. It imbues it with slightly more action-oriented gameplay and brings in elements of Greek mythology, but the end product feels like more of a lateral move than anything. Compare that to Uncharted, which did owe a lot to Tomb Raider, but carved its own path through its more structured set pieces and a focus on character relationships, to the point that it wound up going full circle and influencing the next batch of Tomb Raider games. When you bring up Uncharted, people don't immediately think of it as a Tomb Raider ripoff anymore, and its own personal influence is a big reason why. That's also why it's necessary to wait until a game releases and has a chance to make an imprint before you start screaming bloody murder. I get the initial urge to accuse someone of stealing your favorite game if you think they're stealing your favorite game, but comparing a complete product that you've played end to end to a 2-minute trailer is pretty silly. You're being a real silly goose if you do that. Sometimes it also takes a game a bit of time to fully come into its own. Fortnite did feel like it was a little bit too close for comfort to PUBG early on, and it actually led to a lawsuit between the two, which was eventually dropped. But the less serious tone and building elements did give Fortnite its own identity, and Epic continued to expand that game in ways PUBG could have never envisioned. They're basically nothing alike now, but even at first you could argue that what was taken by Fortnite from PUBG wasn't PUBG's to begin with. And this is where we really get into the weeds, since you could argue PUBG itself took a lot from other games like H1Z1, so now we gotta get into like grand influence. This gives games even more of the benefit of the doubt, because yeah, if Crowsworn has the same winding map, rest system, death system, shop system, etc. as Hollow Knight, it does begin to get really close in comparison, but also each of those things were taken by Hollow Knight from other games. Leaving your currency behind on death, that's from the Souls games, finding little save rooms, I've seen that in Castlevania. Most of the abilities you get in this game were first introduced in any number of older titles, and I mean, the entire genre it's a part of is named after the two series that influenced it the most. Is Crowsworn a ripoff just for taking the same pile of influence as Hollow Knight did and just taking one more from Hollow Knight to boot? Why is Hollow Knight not a ripoff then? What about the hints of Bloodborne and DMC that Crowsworn's devs have said themselves help shape their game? Now its secret formula is different, different, isn't it? Are we just gonna ignore the fact that Crowsworn supersedes its similarities to Hollow Knight and just pretend like finding the same ideas and style interesting is grounds for intellectual theft? What about Lies of P? It borrows heavily from Bloodborne's art direction and is a direct descendant of From Software's patented gameplay, so is it a ripoff because it copies Bloodborne's entire framework, or is it more affectionately deemed as inspired by Bloodborne because it has a completely different story that seems less cryptic than Souls, or its animatronic upgrades seem like they add a distinct quality to the combat? Or is the answer that it just doesn't matter because it looks good and that's all that should count? At the end of the day, any product is just a play for our attention. If you can't capture our attention, you won't sell. If you can't hold our attention, you might net a decent return at first, but you don't have the legs to continue any initial success or repeat it with future projects. Outside of monopolies or series that have managed to coast off their older, more inspired entries, nothing new that comes out is successful for no discernible reason. Whether it feels one of a kind or reminiscent of one of your favorite games, if a product wants to stand on its own 2 feet, it needs to have something that speaks to an audience, even if it's something that we don't always understand. The more I think about it, the more I start to agree that every idea should be stolen, like Picasso and Tarantino and that guy who makes music and isn't known for anything else have already said. Take anything you want. If you can't make it your own and speak to the people, then you'll fail. If you can put a new spin on it, even if that spin is as basic and stupid as let's do a horny reality show but make everyone British, if it resonates with an audience, then you'll succeed. That's what creativity is about, coming up with stuff based on your experience and personal input and combining it with the known and the unknown or unexpected. It's the developer's job to decide what to get inspired by, what to research and experiment with, and what's better to be done by the book. Conscious or subconscious, you're always influenced by what you experienced or enjoyed anyways, but usually there are always limits: budget, time, experience, and so on, and it's ultimately your choice where you want to put most of your effort into. Games and game development in general are very complex things. It's important how they look, no doubt, but what's more important is how they play, because it's an encapsulation of multiple creative efforts: engineering, game design, visuals, feel, accessibility, and many more. It's all really hard to pull off decently regardless. In the end, all that matters is a great game. That's the thing that it's all about. That's the thing that'll ultimately turn heads. You can't steal success, you have to work for it. And don't just take my word on it because we all know I'm a bumbling idiot. That last paragraph is actually courtesy of Yura Zdanovich, co-founder of Sad Cat Studios and game director of Replaced, which I touched on earlier. I had a short chat with him about the idea of influence versus theft and how much was conscious versus subconscious, and I'll leave his full thoughts over on my Discord, which you can find in the description. Unfortunately, we weren't able to talk specifically about his experience with his game being called, I'd claim very unjustly, a ripoff, because the team's in high gear working on finishing things up and there was a whole PR process that would have been involved if he gave out extra info on his game. You know, chain of command, bureaucracy, you get it. But I found his take really insightful as somebody who clearly has this incredible vision and grasp on what he wants to create, even though it's been clearly shaped by dozens, if not hundreds of games before it, some of which he may not even be directly aware of. Replaced looks like it's the culmination of so many ideas from cinematic platformers and retro-futurist media, but it also feels distinctly like its own thing with its own identity, and it'll succeed or fail when it comes out by whether that identity can speak to an audience or not. Success is not a shared resource. A product is able to stand on its own with a mountain of financial success and cultural impact, and then spawn other successful ideas that don't cannibalize the original. If a so-called rip-off is built by passionate people who have their own creative agency, we're left with another fantastic piece of media. And if it isn't, or if it's made by a team that just isn't up to snuff, then nobody plays them and we move on. How many people do you think actually talk about Lotus Knight aside from when it's brought up as a Hollow Knight clone? Exactly, nobody cares. It doesn't matter. Hardly anyone's gonna buy that thing when it comes out. Enchanted Portals is a Cuphead clone that launched on Kickstarter a while back, and everything about it looks lower quality than Cuphead. It doesn't look as good, it doesn't look like it plays as good, and as a result, people didn't push it remotely close to its Kickstarter goal. It might still release one day and try and ride off the coattails of a more successful game, and it may just succeed to a degree. I mean, I only know about it because of its ties to Cuphead, so it clearly helps a little, but this game is gonna cost hundreds of thousands of dollars to make, and it won't sell like hotcakes off the premise of looking slightly like something else that's way better. Now, if it can really master its own boss design or add a unique flavor that people can't get from Cuphead, that's a whole other thing, but we'll only really know when it comes out. The argument that these studios are snatching ideas off other games to try and make a quick buck completely falls apart the second that you move past talking about broken knockoffs that took 2 weeks to develop and into games that took years of dev time. The Last Night's cost of production looks like it's coming out to about $1 million, and it has one of the densest implementations of pixel art we've ever seen. Nobody in their right mind is gonna try and and copy that to steal its hype, and nobody with the actual talent to make something like this from scratch with all of its intricacies is settling for being a pure copycat, much less a copycat of a goddamn trailer. But maybe the issue isn't that games are quote-unquote stealing from other games. Maybe it's that not citing your influences at times seems a little bit skeevy. The criticisms around Crowsworn started dying down when Team Cherry, Hollow Knight's devs, openly supported the game, and when Hollow Knight's publisher involved himself with Crowsworn as well. I mentioned at the top of the video how an open homage or sample is viewed more favorably than works that don't acknowledge where they grab their concepts or baselines from. But of everything we've talked about, this is maybe the most difficult thing to come to a conclusion about, because influence can be subconscious, it can be self-explanatory, and it can even not be there despite seeming like it is. So the topic of when to give credit is a bit of a messy one. Tarantino calls Kung Fu Panda a parody of Kill Bill, citing how obvious it makes it, but even though the creators never put out a press release mentioning Kill Bill's inspiration, he doesn't seem to mind because he gets the game. He's done similar things himself, and they're not exactly hiding that influence.
They're doing me a favor, they're keeping me pop culturally relevant. Priceless.
Meanwhile, to touch once again on Replaced, Tim Saray, the director of The Last Night, seemed to suggest that Sad Cat Studios should have noted his game as an influence, as that was the right thing to do, and he had done that himself in a follow-up video to his first trailer. He didn't seem to be bashing the game, but it was a slightly passive-aggressive response. I always found it a little bit weird though, because he said this the same day Replaced was first announced. And it wasn't revealed in a blog post or a YouTube trailer or something, it was sandwiched inside of a much bigger event. It literally had time to show a quick trailer and then they moved on. Were they supposed to begin the trailer with inspired by a trailer for another game? No, obviously not. That would be weird as hell. Who has ever done that? It's even stranger because his own making of video that he linked in his tweet as an example of giving credit was released 4 months after his game's announcement trailer, yet apparently Replaced should have publicly declared their influences within hours of putting their game out into the world. And that's assuming that Replaced even took direct influence from The Last Night to begin with, which yes is likely considering their similarities, but it's not a certainty. It may have just been the result of experimentation leading to a similar result without any conscious imitation. Trying to assume the origins of people's creativity or their intentions for mentioning or not mentioning inspirations is a slippery slope. Sometimes things just happen out of pure coincidence. I've made videos that are very similar in content to other people's, which just so happen to come out within a few hours of one another, which luckily automatically eliminates any accusations of theft from either party because one clearly couldn't have copied the other so quickly. But with any video, I could potentially present the same information in the same general order as anybody else. I still think back to a comment I got once that told me I had stolen that video from another creator, and when I asked who, they said, "You already know." I got the comment about a year ago, but it still bums me out to think that somebody thought something I put time and effort into was just a carbon copy of somebody else's work. Then again, there will always be a chance that I'll make something that resembles something else I've never seen or have seen and completely forgot. And at that point, my hope is that people find value in my own creativity and manner of approaching a given topic, and if they don't, if the value I'm providing in my work in comparison to others is negligible, I've failed as a creative and deserve that criticism. I've seen accusations made by creators, big and small, of other people stealing their content, and as somebody who does like to give the benefit of the doubt, the turning point for me is whether the thief has any particular insights of their own or an effective, creative method of discussing the same information. If you present the same points in the same way with equal or less content than somebody else, that's a good indication that something's gone past influence. And I do think that sums up most of my feelings around influence versus theft in entertainment. It's not about what's the same, it's not about whether you cite all your sources, and it's not about whether you get into the good graces of the teams or individuals you seem to be emulating. It's about what else you bring to the table. Comparisons will always be made. I know I won't stop using them because they're effective and helpful for contextualizing the media we consume, but the idea that a game that looks like something else or plays like something else can't be overwhelmingly creative in its own right is just dumb. We shouldn't see games that look or play like the games we love and assume they're trying to hijack those games' success. We shouldn't see trailers for Crowsworn or Replaced or Lies of P and say, "What the hell, you cheap knockoff bastards?" If they're cheap knockoff bastards, then people won't play their game and the problem solves itself. If you think there's nothing new to offer, then don't engage with it, but don't punish games that have potential and an artistic vision just because you've seen some of their ideas before. Embrace what looks cool to you and reject what doesn't, but don't define a game by its influences unless they truly begin and end on old ideas. As always, I'd love to hear your guys' thoughts on all this. Leave your takes in the comments. If you're new here, subscribe, join the Discord that's in the description, and I'll see y'all next time. Peace.